The sleeping bags were still warm. 10 years after 6 university students vanished without a trace in the Swiss Alps, rescue pilot Klaus Brenner found their camp buried under 30 feet of snow. The tents were standing. The food was still frozen on the table. Personal belongings were scattered exactly where they had been left, but the students were nowhere to be found. Not dead, not buried, not scattered by avalanches. They had simply walked away from everything they needed to survive and disappeared into thin air. The camp was so perfectly preserved that investigators called it too clean to be natural. What they found inside would rewrite everything we know about missing persons cases. 6 brilliant students had walked into the mountains in January 2013 as part of an extreme survival challenge. They were supposed to spend 3 weeks testing new winter gear for a Swiss outdoor equipment company. They had GPS trackers, satellite phones, and daily check-ins scheduled with their professor. They were prepared for everything except disappearing completely. The rescue team that found their camp called it too clean to be natural. Everything was exactly where it should be, except for the people who had put it there. What made 6 experienced hikers abandon a perfectly functional camp in the middle of a blizzard, leaving behind everything they needed to survive? What they found in that camp would change how investigators think about missing persons cases in extreme environments forever. The students weren't random adventure seekers. Maya Chen, 23, held 3 mountaineering records. David Kellner, 25, was a former Swiss Army mountain rescue specialist. Elena Rossi, 22, was studying glaciology and knew more about snow behavior than most professional guides. Thomas Bowman, 24, was a wilderness medical technician. Sarah Lindquist, 23, was a survival psychology researcher. Jakob Muller Archelu was their leader, a PhD student who had survived solo expeditions across 3 continents. These weren't college kids looking for Instagram photos. They were the people other people called when they got lost in the mountains. The outdoor gear company had invested 200,000 Swiss francs in their research. The plan was simple. The students would hike to a remote valley called Tal der Chaton, establish a base camp, and spend 3 weeks testing prototype winter gear. They would document everything, send daily reports, and emerge with data that would revolutionize cold weather survival equipment. The valley was isolated but not dangerous. On January 15, 2013, they reached their planned campsite and sent their first report. Everything was perfect. The gear was working, the weather was holding, and they had found an ideal spot protected from wind. The temperature was minus 20 degrees, but their new sleeping bags were keeping them warm. They had enough food for a month and fresh water from a nearby stream. That morning never came. When Dr. Weiss didn't receive their 8 a.m. radio call, he waited an hour and tried again, nothing. By noon, he had contacted the Swiss Alpine Rescue Service. By evening, helicopters were searching the valley. The storm that hit that night was worse than anything the weather service had predicted. For 6 days, rescue teams couldn't even fly over the area. When they finally could, they found nothing. The search lasted for months. Professional rescue teams, military helicopters, and volunteer climbers found nothing. They used heat-sensing cameras, ground-penetrating radar, and avalanche probes. The rock formation Maya had described didn't exist. The stream Jakob had mentioned wasn't on any map. The GPS coordinates they had transmitted led to a cliff face that no one could have reached. The families never stopped searching. The insurance companies eventually paid out death benefits. The university created a memorial scholarship. The Swiss Alpine Rescue Service classified the case as unexplained disappearance with unusual circumstances. 10 years passed. The case became a legend among mountain rescue workers. New search techniques were developed and tested in the valley. Satellite imagery was analyzed pixel by pixel. Nothing changed. The students were gone, and no one knew why. Klaus Brenner had been flying rescue missions for 23 years when he spotted the fabric. On March 12, 2023, he was returning from a routine medical evacuation when something caught his eye through the storm clouds. A small patch of red material was visible through the snow, about 15 miles from where the students were supposed to have been. He circled back for a closer look and realized he was seeing the corner of a tent. The excavation took 3 days. What they found was impossible. The campsite was exactly as the students had described. The rock formation was real, the stream that was flowing under the snow. The GPS coordinates were accurate, but the campsite was buried under 30 feet of packed snow. The preservation was perfect. The tents were still standing, supported by the weight of snow. Inside the main tent, investigators found the students' journals, their radio equipment, and their meals exactly as they had left them. A pot of soup sat on their camp stove, frozen solid. Their sleeping bags were arranged in a circle. Personal items were scattered around casually, but the students were gone. Not a single trace of human remains was found. Their winter coats hung on hooks inside the tent. Their boots were lined up by the entrance. Everything they needed to survive was there, but they had left it all behind. The final journal entry was dated January 16, 2013. Maya had written about unusual weather patterns and strange acoustic phenomena. She described hearing voices in the wind and seeing lights that didn't match any known weather patterns. David had documented equipment malfunctions that made no sense. His thermometer was reading temperatures that varied by 30 degrees within minutes. His compass was spinning randomly. His watch had stopped, but the hands were moving backward. Elena's glaciology notes were the most disturbing. She had measured the snow depth at different points around the camp and found inconsistencies that violated basic physics. That snow that should have been deeper was shallow. Areas that should have been shallow were deep. The patterns made no sense according to wind direction, temperature, or terrain. She had written one word in large letters across the bottom of her final page: wrong. Thomas had been treating the team for symptoms that didn't match any known altitude sickness or exposure condition. Everyone was experiencing vertigo, but only at specific times of day. They were all having the same recurring dream about walking through empty cities. Their heart rates were synchronized, beating at exactly 72 beats per minute, regardless of activity level. His medical training couldn't explain any of it. Sarah's psychological observations were equally strange. The team was experiencing collective behavior changes that didn't match any known stress response. They were all losing track of time in identical ways. They would start conversations and forget them mid-sentence. They were all drawing the same symbols in the snow without realizing it. The symbols weren't from any language or culture any of them knew. Jakob's final entry was a single sentence: "We're going to look for the others." Below it, he had drawn a map showing a route leading away from the camp toward an area marked village. But there was no village anywhere near their location. The map showed buildings, roads, and landmarks that didn't exist. The route led directly toward the cliff face that search teams had identified as impassable. The forensics team found footprints leading away from the camp in the direction Jakob had indicated. 6 sets of prints perfectly preserved in the snow. The prints were clear for about 50 meters, then they simply stopped. Not at a cliff edge, not at a stream, not at any natural barrier. They just ended in the middle of open ground, as if the students had walked 50 meters and then vanished into the air. The investigation reopened immediately. The Swiss authorities brought in experts from around the world. Psychologists studied the journal entries. Physicists analyzed the equipment readings. Anthropologists examined the symbols. Meteorologists tried to explain the weather anomalies. None of them could provide answers that made sense. The equipment the students had left behind was functioning perfectly. Their radios worked. Their GPS devices were accurate. Their weather instruments gave normal readings, but the data they had recorded while at the camp was impossible. Temperatures that couldn't exist, atmospheric pressure readings that would have been fatal, magnetic compass variations that would have required them to be at the North Pole. The most disturbing discovery was the food. The students had documented eating specific meals on specific days. Their food supply should have been depleted after 3 weeks in the camp, but when investigators counted the remaining supplies, they found enough food for 6 people to survive. For 6 months, the students had been eating, but somehow the food wasn't disappearing. The portions they had consumed were still there, exactly as they had prepared them. The Swiss authorities classified the case as unexplained disappearance, with anomalous physical evidence. The official report was sealed for national security reasons. The families were told that the investigation was ongoing but that no further information could be released. The campsite was declared a restricted area and removed from all public maps. Dr. Weiss retired from the university 6 months after the camp was discovered. He had spent 10 years believing his students were dead, finding evidence that they had survived weeks longer than expected, only to vanish under impossible circumstances, was worse than never finding them at all. He moved to a small village in the Austrian Alps and refused to discuss the case with anyone. The outdoor gear company that had sponsored the expedition quietly recalled all the prototype equipment the students had been testing. They claimed it was a routine quality control measure, but employees reported that the equipment was destroyed rather than returned to production. The company's winter testing program was permanently discontinued. Klaus Brenner transferred to a different rescue unit after finding the camp. He had been flying over the Alps for more than 2 decades and had never seen anything he couldn't explain. The campsite had been there for 10 years, but it hadn't appeared on any of the hundreds of aerial searches conducted in the area. The snow patterns around it were wrong. The location was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The families received the personal items found in the camp, but many of them reported that things were missing. Maya's parents said her journal was incomplete. David's brother couldn't find a compass that David never traveled without. Elena's sister noticed that research equipment Elena had specifically mentioned in her final radio transmission wasn't in the camp. The students had left behind everything they needed to survive, but they had taken specific items that made no sense. The final mystery was the most disturbing. When investigators carefully mapped the exact location of the camp, they discovered it was sitting directly on top of the site where search teams had concentrated their efforts in 2013. The camp had been buried exactly where hundreds of people had been looking for it. Professional rescue workers with decades of experience had searched that exact spot repeatedly and found nothing. The camp had been there the entire time, but somehow it had been invisible until Klaus Brenner spotted it through the storm. 6th, students walked into the Swiss Alps in 2013 to test winter survival gear. They found something that wasn't supposed to exist. They documented impossible weather conditions, recorded equipment readings that defied physics, and drew maps of places that weren't there. They survived for weeks in conditions that should have killed them in days. They ate food that somehow never decreased. They left behind everything they needed to live and walked 50 meters into empty air. The camp is still there, buried under 30 feet of snow, perfectly preserved and completely wrong. The Swiss authorities have posted guards to keep people away, but they won't explain why. The investigation is ongoing, but no new evidence has been found. The students are still missing, and no one knows where they went or why they left. But the story doesn't end there. 3 months after the camp was discovered, something else happened that made investigators realize they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple disappearance. Mountain rescue teams started reporting equipment failures in the area around the camp. GPS devices would malfunction. Radios would pick up transmissions in languages that didn't exist. Compasses would spin wildly before pointing toward the exact spot where the students' footprints had vanished. The first rescue worker to experience these phenomena was Maria Santos, a veteran climber with 15 years of alpine experience. She was conducting routine avalanche surveys when her equipment began behaving exactly like the students had described in their journals. Her thermometer showed impossible temperature readings. Her altimeter claimed she was 2,000 feet higher than she actually was. Her watch stopped and started moving backward, but Maria noticed something the students hadn't documented. The malfunctions weren't random, they followed a pattern. Every piece of equipment failed at exactly 3:47 p.m. local time. The failures lasted for exactly 17 minutes. During those 17 minutes, Maria heard voices calling her name from directions where no one was standing. She saw lights moving through the snow that cast no shadows. She felt the ground vibrating beneath her feet in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. When Maria's equipment returned to normal, she found footprints in the snow that hadn't been there before, fresh prints made in the previous few minutes, leading away from her position toward the area where the students had vanished. The prints were the exact size and pattern of the hiking boots the students had been wearing, but the prints were made by someone walking backward, as if they were trying to return to where they came from. Maria radioed for immediate evacuation. The rescue helicopter that came to get her experienced the same equipment failures she had described. The pilot, Andreas Keller, watched his instruments go haywire at exactly 3:47 p.m. His GPS showed him flying over cities that didn't exist. His radio picked up conversations between people who claimed to be the missing students. The voices were clear and desperate, asking for help finding their way back to camp. The conversations were recorded automatically by the helicopter's black box system. When investigators analyzed the recordings, they found 6 distinct voices matching the vocal patterns of the missing students. The voices were discussing their current situation, but nothing they said made sense. They talked about walking through forests in an area where no trees grew. They described meeting other people who were also lost, people who had been missing. For decades, they mentioned seeing buildings and roads that were clearly visible but led nowhere. The most disturbing recording was Jacobe Muller's voice describing their current location. He gave detailed GPS coordinates and landmark descriptions that placed the group in 3 different countries simultaneously. According to his description, they were walking through a valley in Switzerland, along a beach in Norway, and through a city in Germany at the same time. The coordinates he provided were mathematically impossible, but he recited them with absolute confidence. The Swiss authorities immediately classified the area as a restricted zone. They installed permanent monitoring equipment designed to detect the equipment failures that seemed to occur regularly. The monitoring station recorded the same 17-minute anomalies that Maria and Andreas had experienced. Every day at 3:47 p.m., every piece of electronic equipment within a 2-mile radius would malfunction in identical ways. During these daily episodes, the monitoring equipment recorded temperature fluctuations that couldn't be explained by weather patterns. The ground temperature would drop 40 degrees in seconds, then return to normal. Electromagnetic readings would spike to levels that should have been visible from space. Sound recordings picked up voices, music, and conversations in languages that linguists couldn't identify. The most significant discovery came when investigators realized the timing of the daily anomalies. The equipment failures began at exactly 3:47 p.m. on January 16, 2013. That was the precise moment when the students' final radio transmission had ended 10 years earlier. The anomalies had been occurring every single day for a decade, but no one had been in the area to notice them. This revelation led to a horrifying possibility. The students might not have vanished at all. They might still be there, trapped in some kind of temporal loop that made them invisible to normal perception. The voices recorded by the helicopter weren't memories or echoes. They were real-time conversations happening in the present moment, but in a version of reality that operated by different rules. Dr. Rebecca Hoffman, a physicist from CERN, was brought in to study the phenomena. She installed equipment designed to detect quantum anomalies and dimensional distortions. What she found challenged everything science understood about the nature of space and time. The area around the camp was experiencing what she called dimensional instability. The physical laws that governed the location were changing randomly, creating pockets of space where normal reality didn't apply. Dr. Hoffman's measurements showed that the camp existed in multiple states simultaneously. In one state it was empty and had been abandoned for 10 years. In another state it was occupied by the students who were living their daily routine, unaware that time had stopped. In a third state it was occupied by dozens of people from different time periods, all lost in the same dimensional trap. The equipment Dr. Hoffman installed began recording conversations between the students and other missing persons from throughout history. The voices included hikers who had vanished in the Alps during the 1800s, soldiers who had gotten lost during World War II, and tourists who had disappeared as recently as 2020. All of them were trapped in the same impossible location. Unable to return to normal reality, the recordings revealed that the students had been trying to help other trapped people find their way back to the normal world. Maya Chen's voice was recorded giving directions to a group of German hikers who had been missing since 1987. David Kellner was heard teaching survival techniques to a Swiss guide who had vanished in 1923. Elena Rossi was documenting the experiences of everyone trapped in the dimensional anomaly, trying to find patterns that might lead to escape. But the most chilling recordings were of the students' growing awareness that they were trapped. Thomas Bowman's voice was recorded explaining to the others that they had been walking in circles for what felt like days, but their watches showed that only minutes had passed. Sarah Lindquist was heard describing how they could see their own camp in the distance, but no matter how far they walked, they never got closer to it. Jakob Muller's final recorded message was a desperate plea for help. He explained that they had realized they were no longer in the normal world and that time was moving differently around them. He described seeing their own rescue teams searching for them, but being unable to make contact. He could see the helicopters flying overhead, but when he tried to signal them, the pilots couldn't see him waving. The dimensional instability was spreading. The affected area was growing larger each day. What had started as a small zone around the camp was expanding outward at a rate of 3 meters per day. At that rate, it would reach the nearest town within 5 years. The Swiss government made the decision to evacuate the entire valley. They told the public it was due to unstable snow conditions, but the real reason was classified. The area was designated as a permanent no-fly zone. Military units were stationed at all access points, but the evacuation revealed another disturbing truth. When investigators interviewed the residents of the valley, they discovered that people had been disappearing from the area for decades. Local records showed 17 missing persons cases dating back to 1952. The disappearances had been attributed to accidents, but no bodies had ever been found. The pattern was always the same. People would go into the mountains for routine activities like hiking, skiing, or hunting. They would be experienced locals who knew the terrain perfectly. They would disappear without a trace, leaving behind no signs of struggle, no equipment, and no explanation. Their families would search for them, but nothing would ever be found. What made these historical disappearances even more disturbing was that several of the missing people had been heard on Dr. Hoffman's recordings. Their voices were clearly identifiable, and they were describing experiences that matched the students' situation exactly. They had all been trapped in the same dimensional anomaly for decades, unable to return to normal reality and unaware that time was passing in the outside world. The oldest voice on the recordings belonged to Heinrich Weber, a local guide who had vanished in 1952. His voice was recorded having conversations with people who had disappeared decades after him, but from his perspective, they had all arrived in the same place at the same time. In the dimensional anomaly, linear time didn't exist. Everyone who had ever been trapped there existed simultaneously in an eternal present moment. Dr. Hoffman's research team made one final discovery that forced the Swiss government to classify the entire incident at the highest level. The dimensional instability wasn't natural. It was the result of an experiment that had gone wrong decades earlier. During World War II, the Nazi regime had conducted secret research into dimensional manipulation in the Swiss Alps. They had been trying to create a weapon that could make entire armies disappear. The experiment had failed catastrophically, creating a permanent tear in space-time. The Nazi researchers had been the first people trapped in the dimensional anomaly. Their voices were among those recorded by Dr. Hoffman's equipment, still conducting their experiments, still trying to perfect their dimensional weapon. Unaware that the war had ended 70 years ago, the Swiss authorities faced an impossible decision. They could try to rescue the trapped people, but that would likely trap more rescuers. They could try to destroy the anomaly, but that might kill everyone inside. They could try to contain it, but it was growing larger every day. The decision was made to classify the entire incident and deny its existence. The families were told that the investigation was closed and that their children had died in an avalanche. The rescue workers were transferred to other units in order never to discuss what they had seen. The monitoring equipment was removed, and the area was sealed off permanently. Dr. Hoffman's research was classified and her team was disbanded. She was offered a position at a classified government facility, where she could continue her research under military supervision. She accepted, but not before making one final recording that was never officially reported. She had detected signs that similar dimensional anomalies existed in other locations around the world. The Swiss Alps incident wasn't unique. It was part of a global phenomenon that governments had been covering up for decades. The students are still there, trapped in a pocket of space-time that operates by rules no one understands. They're still trying to find their way back to their camp, still documenting their experiences, still hoping for rescue. But they're not alone. They're part of a community of lost souls from across the centuries, all trapped in the same impossible place, all trying to solve the same unsolvable puzzle. Every day at 3:47 p.m., their voices can still be heard on radio frequencies that officially don't exist. They're still calling for help, still describing their surroundings, still believing that someone will eventually find them and bring them. Whom they don't know that 10 years have passed. They don't know that their families have given up hope. They don't know that their disappearance has been covered up and forgotten. The only thing anyone knows for certain is that 6 expert survivalists discovered something in the Swiss Alps that changed every rule about what's possible in the natural world. They documented it carefully, recorded it precisely, and then walked away from safety towards something that shouldn't exist. They've been walking for 10 years now, and no one knows where they're going. But the terrifying truth is that they're not going anywhere at all. They're trapped in an eternal moment forever, trying to find their way home to a world that has moved on without them.